Leaving a 5-star review doesn't summon any spirits, probably. But it does help Vivid Nightmares reach more true crime lovers who like their cases with a side of creepy. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen. Click the stars and help me keep the nightmares coming. Vivid Nightmares. Hey guys, welcome back to Vivid Nightmares. I'm your host, Bridget Denise, and tonight we're going someplace colder, quieter, and a little harder to shake off when the episode ends. This week's stories come from buildings that were supposed to bring peace, places built to heal broken minds, treat invisible wounds, offer safety and structure. But instead, these walls witnessed abuse, neglect, experiments, and silence. This is Southern Asylums, Sanatoriums, and Sanitariums, where the air still holds screams that never made it out. And look, I'm just saying, if your hospital has more ghosts than staff, you might want to break that lease. We've got abandoned wards, rusted gurneys, voices calling from locked rooms, and maybe, just maybe, the ghosts of those who never should have been there in the first place. Grab your flashlight and let's check into the South's most haunted institutions. First stop tonight, Central State Hospital, Milledgeville, Georgia. Now, this place wasn't just a hospital. It was a city within a city. At its peak in the 1960s, Central State was the largest mental health facility in the world. Over 12,000 patients were housed on site. It had its own railroad, police force, church, and farm. It was nicknamed the City of the Living Dead, and that might not have been entirely wrong. Originally opened in 1842 as the Georgia Lunatic Asylum, yes, that's what they actually called it. It started with just a few patients, but as decades passed and mental health became a catch-all category, the population exploded. You didn't have to be insane to get locked up here. Epileptics, alcoholics, pregnant teens, orphans, poor folks deemed unmanageable. Basically, if you made someone uncomfortable in 1880, they had a bed waiting for you. Now the real horror came with how people were treated. Overcrowding was so bad that patients slept in hallways. Nurses were overwhelmed. Doctors were, let's say, experimental. Lobotomies, insulin shock therapy, restraints. People were forgotten, records were lost, and in some cases, buried. Literally. There's a cemetery on the property with more than 25,000 unmarked graves. Metal markers were originally used, but they were pulled out to make mowing the lawn easier. Yeah, that's a real choice someone made. As the hospital declined in the 1970s and 80s, more buildings were shut down. Today, only a small portion remains open for care. But dozens of the original wards, they're abandoned, boarded up windows, peeling paint, and rooms that still echo. Ghost hunters who've toured the property have caught EVPs, disembodied voices whispering things like help or stop. Others say they've seen full-bodied apparitions in hospital gowns, walking down halls that haven't been used in decades. Some visitors claim to feel hands on their shoulders, hear metal doors slam, or catch a glimpse of a woman standing at the window of Ward 5, even though that building's been locked for over 40 years. And the scariest part? The ghosts aren't angry, they're confused, like they still think they're patients, waiting for a visit that never came. Central State isn't just haunted, it's heavy. But we're not done yet, because next, we're heading to Alabama, where another institution promised peace and left behind a trail of sorrow. All right, next up, we're heading to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where one of the most beautiful buildings in the state once hid some of its darkest secrets, Bryce Hospital. Originally known as the Alabama State Hospital for the Insane, because subtlety was not a strong suit back then. Bryce opened its doors in 1861, right at the beginning of the Civil War. It was massive, ornate, even elegant, built in what they called the Kirkbride style. Big central wings, open courtyards, designed to give patients light, air, and peace. Sounds hopeful, right? Well, that didn't last long. As the years rolled on, what started as a forward-thinking institution became a warehouse for the unwanted. By the 1950s and 60s, Bryce was housing more than 5,000 patients, many of whom should never have been there at all. Some were committed for things like depression, postpartum anxiety, learning disabilities, even homosexuality. And just like at Central State, the treatment here was often worse than the illness. Overcrowding, neglect, lack of funding. And in some cases, abuse. Just once, I'd love to cover a hospital that didn't turn into a horror story by the second paragraph. In the 1970s, a former patient named Wyatt filed a class action lawsuit, claiming the hospital was cruel, inhumane, and degrading. And y'all, he wasn't wrong. Patients were found sleeping on floors. Some were malnourished, others were just left. No care, no therapy, just forgotten. It became one of the most famous mental health lawsuits in U.S. history. And the result? The state had to finally start reforming its system, but the damage was already done. And the spirits? They never really left. Visitors to the now partially abandoned facility have reported cold spots, the sound of moaning through locked doors, and even full apparitions of patients wandering the upper halls. Some say you can hear a woman crying in the former women's wing, her voice soft and distant, like she's calling for someone who never came back. Security guards have quit after being pushed, followed, or whispered to. Ghost hunters claim to have caught voices saying, "Don't leave me on tape." And the old hydrotherapy room, let's just say, if you thought you were alone in there, you're probably not. Because nothing says relax and recover like being locked in a tiled room while something unseen watches you. Today, the main building has been partially preserved, but most of the old wings sit empty, rotting, peeling, and still echoing from light and peace to shadows and silence. But we've still got more to uncover. Next up, we're heading down to Louisiana, to a facility once known as the Ellis Island of the South. And not for good reasons. Next, we're heading deep into Louisiana, past Baton Rouge, along the twisting roads near False River, to the site of what was once called the Ellis Island of the South, Lakeland Asylum. Officially, it was known as the Louisiana State Insane Asylum at Jackson, but folks around here, they called it Lakeland, and they whispered about it. Opened in the 1840s, this place quickly became the go-to dumping ground for anyone the state didn't know what to do with. The poor, the mentally ill, orphans, women considered troublesome, Black men and women labeled insane for things like grief, anger, or simply existing too loudly. And the nickname Ellis Island of the South, that didn't come from freedom. It came from the fact that people were shipped here by the trainload, dropped off, forgotten. Sometimes without names, sometimes without hope. It wasn't an island, it was a trap. By the early 1900s, Lakeland was overcrowded, understaffed, and known for its brutal treatments, restraints, electric shocks, experimental surgeries, isolation. Even the architecture turned cold. Long corridors lined with barred windows, locked doors. No one to hear you if you screamed. Patients were buried on the grounds, sometimes in mass graves marked only with numbers. And y'all, the hauntings? They didn't wait until the place shut down. Staff have long told stories of hearing footsteps following them down empty halls, voices whispering from vents, and sudden cold winds sweeping through rooms with no windows open. Some say the infirmary building is the most active. Lights flicker. Metal cabinets slam. And more than one nurse reported hearing a man chanting prayers in a locked room that hadn't been used in decades. There's also the spirit of a young girl in a blue nightgown, seen drifting near the old children's ward. She doesn't speak, but if you meet her eyes, she vanishes. And there's something especially heartbreaking about ghost children. They didn't ask for this place. They were just left. Even paranormal investigators have said Lakeland carries residual sorrow, not just fear, but grief, exhaustion, like the walls themselves are tired. Today, parts of the hospital have been demolished. Others were turned into newer care facilities, but locals still say, don't go near the woods behind the old campus at night. That's where the rail tracks used to run. And sometimes, you can still hear the whistle of a train pulling in to drop off the forgotten. Some hospitals were built to help, but this one, it was built to hide people. And the ghosts know it. Next, we head even deeper into the South, to a place where the line between madness and memory is still blurred by the water.
Have your own theory about tonight's case? Think the wrong person was blamed, or maybe someone wasn't blamed enough? Hit us up on Instagram or TikTok and drop your theory in the comments. I love hearing your take on these twisted stories. Your voice might even make it into a future episode.
All right, y'all. This next one takes us to Chattahoochee, Florida, a small town right by the Apalachicola River, near the Georgia border. And tucked into its winding roads and Spanish moss is a place that's quietly held Florida's darkest stories for over a century. Florida State Hospital. Locals still call it Chattahoochee. And if you're from the area, you already know you don't joke about it. Originally built in 1876, the hospital was once a military arsenal, but was converted into a mental institution after the Civil War. It started small, but grew fast. Too fast. Like the others we've covered tonight, it took in everyone. The mentally ill, the poor, the elderly, epileptics, veterans with PTSD, before they had a name for it, and sometimes people who just didn't have anyone to speak for them. If you were inconvenient in 1890, Chattahoochee was your one-way ticket. By the mid-20th century, horror stories started leaking out. Patients were allegedly tied to beds for days, given ice baths, and drugged into silence. One inspector in the 1950s reported finding patients locked in isolation cells with no clothes, no mattresses, and no toilets. Others were left to wander, filthy and confused, with no access to therapy, just sedation. And then came the ghosts. Staff have long reported seeing shadowy figures in the admin building, especially around the old wards that were shut down after the lawsuits started piling up. Some hear screaming in the early morning hours, from wings that haven't been occupied in years. The elevators, they still run, even when the power's been cut. More than one night shift nurse has said they've heard the unmistakable sound of wheels, like an old gurney being pushed across tile, only to turn the corner and find nothing but empty hallways. There's one specific room, room 9, deep in the original ward, that maintenance workers refuse to enter. They say it's always cold. The lights never stay on. And one man claims he saw a woman in a hospital gown just standing in the corner. When he turned the lights back on, she was gone, but the scent of her perfume stayed behind. Today, Florida State Hospital is still operational, though only for forensic psychiatric patients. But the older buildings, boarded up, covered in vines, and still humming. Locals say if you walk past after dark, especially near the old medical building, you might hear someone crying through the bricks or calling your name. And if you answer, well, you might not walk away alone. They say madness echoes, but some places, it clings. Let's head up to Tennessee next, where an institution born from good intentions left behind a legacy soaked in silence. Next up, we're in Nashville, Tennessee. And no, we're not talking country music tonight. We're talking about the place Nashville used to whisper about, but never really wanted to look at too closely.
Leaving a 5-star review doesn't summon any spirits. Probably. But it does help Vivid Nightmares reach more true crime lovers who like their cases with a side of creepy. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen. Click the stars and help me keep the nightmares coming.
Tennessee State Hospital for the Insane. It opened in 1852 under that exact name, and y'all, it wasn't subtle. Back then it was supposed to be state of the art. Big open windows, long verandas, gardens to walk through. It followed the same Kirkbride plan as Bryce Hospital. It was hopeful on paper. But like so many others, it didn't stay that way. By the turn of the century, the hospital had become overcrowded, underfunded, and deeply segregated. Black patients were sent to separate wards, often with fewer resources and more abuse. Doctors, if you could call them that, were known to use early shock therapies, ice bath punishments, and for a while, even experimental radiation. Patients were frequently left in restraints, sometimes for days, and many of them were buried on the grounds in unmarked graves. Because nothing says we cared like tossing people into the dirt with no nameplate. But the weird part? The staff knew it was haunted, even back then. Early nurses reported lights turning on and off, doors swinging open on their own. And one figure, a woman in black, who was said to glide silently down the east hallway just after midnight. Some believed she was a former nurse who took her own life in the 1920s. Others thought she was a patient, one who never got to say goodbye. Either way, she never left. Paranormal teams that visited the property in the early 2000s before more of it was demolished caught clear EVPs, a child's laugh, a low voice saying can't sleep, and even footsteps circling them on the upper floor, while their motion detectors picked up nothing. There's also the story of the mirror in the old staff lounge. Legend has it that if you looked into it during a night shift, you'd see someone else standing behind you, a man in patient clothes, just watching. And sometimes he was smiling. The mirror's gone now. Smashed when the wing was torn down. But that part of the building still gives people the chills. And the graves, they're still there. Tucked behind tall grass and broken trees, no headstones, no names, just earth. And echoes, we like to think of healing as soft. But in these halls, it came with silence, chains, and shadows. There's one last stop tonight. An asylum that tried to grow too fast, house too many, and still refuses to let go of what it saw. Our final stop tonight takes us back to Louisiana, to the town of Jackson, where the air is thick with heat, history, and something else. Something that doesn't like being disturbed.
This show runs on coffee, research rabbit holes, and Southern ghost stories whispered in the dark. If you'd like to support Vivid Nightmares, consider leaving a rating and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It really helps the show reach more listeners. And if you want even more haunted history and unsolved stories, visit our link in the show notes to grab bonus content and more. Thanks for helping keep the nightmares vivid.
Welcome to East Louisiana State Hospital. It opened in 1847, just before the Civil War, on a stretch of quiet land about 30 miles north of Baton Rouge. And just like every other asylum we've covered tonight, this one started with good intentions, treatment, reform, rehabilitation. But what they built instead was a holding cell for suffering. By the mid-1900s, East Louisiana had ballooned into one of the largest psychiatric facilities in the region, with over 4,000 patients crammed into overcrowded buildings. They came by train. They were dropped off by family. Some arrived without names. Some never left. Treatments range from sedation and seclusion to full-body electroshock, hydrotherapy, and insulin coma therapy. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. Patients were frequently restrained, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. And the ghosts, they don't rest. Staff and visitors alike have heard footsteps echo through the abandoned wings, doors slamming from floors no one's allowed to enter, and voices calling names that aren't on any roster anymore. In the oldest buildings, people report a feeling of being watched closely, like someone is standing just behind your shoulder. But when you turn around, there's nothing, just air, heavy, still air. And then there's the chapel building. By day, it's quiet, but at night, people have reported hearing organ music, slow, sad, even though there's no working organ inside. Others say they've seen a woman in a white nurse's uniform walk through the pews, then vanish right into the wall. The old hydrotherapy ward is sealed off now, but when the wind hits just right, you can still hear metal clanking, like tubs being dragged across tile. One janitor once quit on the spot after claiming he saw a man sitting in a bathtub, dripping wet. Except, the room had been dry for decades. Listen, if your shift starts and ends with a phantom bath ghost, you don't need that job. You need a sage stick and a new zip code. Today, parts of the hospital are still in operation, mostly for forensic and long-term care. But the abandoned sections, they've been overtaken by moss, dust, and silence. The air's stale. The lights don't always work. And every now and then people still say they hear someone crying, but only when they're alone. Thousands walk those halls, hoping for healing. What they found was a lifetime of shadows. And for some, that silence still hasn't ended. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey, through padded walls, locked doors, and the shadows that still linger long after the keys were lost. We walked the empty corridors of Central State, stood in the silence of Bryce, heard voices through broken windows at Lakeland, felt the cold breath of Chattahoochee, caught whispers behind mirrors at Nashville's Asylum, and traced the grief still echoing through East Louisiana. These weren't just haunted hospitals. They were places where real people, many of them forgotten, lived, suffered, and sometimes never left. And while the ghosts are chilling, it's the history that haunts hardest. If there's one thing I've learned digging into these stories, it's that the scariest spirits are often the ones born from silence, not screams. If you're still listening, thank you for sitting with these shadows with me tonight. And if you felt something, hit that subscribe button, leave a review, tell your ghost hunting cousin or your true crime group chat. You know they'd love this one. You can always find me on Instagram or TikTok in Vivid Nightmares Pod, or send me your own haunted institution story at vividnightmarespod@gmail.com. I'm your host, Bridget Denise, and this has been Vivid Nightmares. But don't wander too far, because next week, we're peeling back the veil on the Southern women they feared, the conjure queens, the midwives, the witches of swamps and red clay, some healed, some cursed, all of them unforgettable. So light your candles, stir your tea clockwise, and I'll see you next Friday. Good night, y'all, and sweet, vivid dreams.
This show runs on coffee, research rabbit holes, and Southern ghost stories whispered in the dark. If you'd like to support Vivid Nightmares, consider leaving a rating and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It really helps the show reach more listeners. And if you want even more haunted history and unsolved stories, visit our link in the show notes to grab bonus content and more. Thanks for helping keep the nightmares vivid.